Hi everybody, my name's Emma and I'm another one of the second year medical students who recently undertook a research project in collaboration with SCCT. And the topic I wanted to look at was the impact of the pandemic on UK undergraduate students. So I'll get right into it. So I just want you to cast your mind back to 2020, and I think a date which will remain etched in our memory for many years to come is the 23rd of March, when the UK government declared a national lockdown, and we saw many changes come about almost overnight. And what's most relevant in this talk was the closure of all education institutions. And just to give you an idea of this population, so there was close to 2.5 million students who enrolled in UK universities in the academic year of 2019 to 20, and close to 3/4 of them were undergraduates. So it's definitely a significant proportion of people, and we'll look into how they were impacted. So this was my research method. I decided to conduct virtual semi-structured interviews, and I recruited participants via convenient sampling. So by this, I basically was in the Students' Union building of the University of Sheffield and asked 5 students who were sort of walking past whether they would be willing to participate. And then we conducted these interviews, and then I conducted a thematic analysis of their responses. And this was to identify the key themes that were brought forward. So the first area that I wanted to explore was how they adapted to online learning. So for most students, this meant that they moved to online platforms such as Google Meet and Blackboard Collaborate, and they had a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous lectures. And for those that aren't familiar with these terms, synchronous lectures are ones which are in real time, so you would join at a particular time, and asynchronous lectures are ones which are pre-recorded and you can join at your own leisure. And there were some benefits to this new way of learning. So obviously the ability to join from anywhere was a massive bonus for students. So this massively reduced their travel time, and they even mentioned how it gave them time to do things that they normally wouldn't do, such as have a nutritious breakfast before they start. So that was definitely a positive. And another good thing that came out of this was an improvement in their digital proficiency. So they are much more comfortable using online platforms and conducting independent study online. And looking at some of the negatives now. So one of the biggest issues that students raised was it was very difficult to interact with peers and educators. And I think we underestimate how important the classroom setting is for learning. Being able to talk to the person sat next to you and maybe come up with a new way of understanding a topic. All of those opportunities were missed with online learning, where your video and your mics are all switched off. So that was one thing. And another issue was that online learning wasn't as suitable for more practical courses. So out of the 5 participants that I interviewed, 2 of them were medical students, and they said that for particular parts of the course, such as cadaveric dissection, for example, it's very difficult to understand something like that with an online module. You really need that hands-on experience. The next topic of interest was social restrictions and how that impacted students. So obviously when the lockdown was declared, campuses across the country were closed and all of their physical building spaces were closed as well. And with regards to actual COVID infections, 3 out of the 5 participants that I interviewed actually contracted COVID while they were in university accommodation. And they did say that quarantine was very challenging. So when you're in your first year of study and you're living with lots of students from different places, you're all sort of acquaintances, and being able to navigate how you use the shared spaces and also stocking up on supplies and things, it was quite a unknown territory for some there. Yeah. And so those are some of the challenges, but I'd like to end this with saying that there were also some positives. So the University of Sheffield were particularly supportive during the quarantine time. So they would offer welfare calls and also ensure students got the support they needed during this time, which was good. And the next topic that I wanted to also ask about was how student well-being was affected. So the first thing was about physical activity, and some of the participants mentioned that they were a lot less active and they were much more inclined to stay indoors, while others said that they carried on with their pre-pandemic exercise routines. So going for regular walks or runs and things were continued. And I thought this was a particularly interesting finding. A book that I read recently called The Power of Habit talks about how once a habit is instilled, people will continue to carry out those routines regardless of changes in the external environment. So maybe this is an example of that, where the pandemic hasn't actually affected them too much. Another aspect of physical well-being is eating patterns. So some participants in the interviews raised this idea that they were maybe eating more and binge eating, where they're snacking more frequently and increasing their meal times. So this was probably a coping mechanism to regain some of the control that they lost during the pandemic and to try and manage their emotions of anxiety and boredom. Another very important aspect of physical well-being is sleep. And two of the biggest concerns that I heard during the interviews was one, finding it harder to get to sleep, and two, having quite broken sleep. And participants raised two possible theories for this. So one was the blue light theory, that maybe their increased use of electronic devices and exposure to blue light was maybe what was affecting their circadian rhythm, and that was making it harder to sleep at night. So this is quite a hypothetical theory, and I think we need more research to confirm this, but this could be one reason. But the other reason was maybe general anxiety about the pandemic made it very difficult to switch off at night. And these intrusive thoughts can really weigh on your mind. And as we know, physical health is very strongly correlated with mental well-being as well. So participants did notice an alarming rise in stress and low mood, both in themselves and among their peers. And another very poignant topic which was raised in the interviews was dealing with grief during the pandemic. So for some, they had lost loved ones, and the restrictions meant that they weren't able to go for burial or cremation ceremonies. And I'm sure you can all understand that this was very difficult. Sort of to gain closure from something so traumatic is difficult when you don't have those usual customs and ceremonies. And now just to look at some research which supported the participant responses. So firstly, with regards to online learning, there was some research which suggested that this overnight shift was similar to a crisis migration model, where in the face of a challenge or an adversity, we very quickly switched to an alternative method to cope with the stress. Secondly, with regards to mental well-being, many surveys actually also pointed to a higher level of depression and alcohol misuse among students and educators during the lockdown period for the reasons that we've mentioned. And also physical activity significantly decreased among this population, so close to 70% fewer steps per day. And that's obviously another very concerning statistic. And again, dietary habits saw both positive and negative impacts. So some people maybe were more inclined to eat better and eat healthy, but others did fall into bad habits of binge eating and having more calorific meals. So now the conclusion, which I'm sure you'll be happy to hear. I think we can all agree there was a massive paradigm shift in the education sector. And with this, it brought some positives and some negatives. So the major positive, which I gathered from the interviews, was that students feel a lot more confident using online platforms, and they're much more competent in using the internet for their own independent study. However, the actual restrictions that also accompanied the pandemic made it very difficult to maintain their well-being during this time. And I think going forward, we would need more longitudinal research to really assess the long-term impact on this cohort, to see how some of these coping mechanisms which have been instilled during the pandemic, how they will be carried forward as they enter the workplace and future relationships. So I think that's everything from me, but I just want to say a big thank you to all of the supervisors at SCCT for facilitating this research. I've really enjoyed my time working on this, and yeah, I welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.
Yay. Well, I think we have to thank you as well, Emma. Really neat piece of work. And even with small numbers, there's a lot has come out of just talking in detail, although the sample size was small. And also the way that you compared it with other research literature, I think has been impressive. I think maybe not everybody knows who's on screen today how short the placement was really. I think it was was it 4 weeks in the end? And I think by the time we'd got ethics approval and everything, it was, you know, it was remarkable what all 4 of you have done in that time. So questions directly to Emma. Carrie.
Hello, Emma. No, really interesting. And we've got a couple of students at the moment on a community placement, which is really good. If you only had 4 weeks, I can quite see how having 5 students was maybe as much as you could cope with. But just out of interest, what year were they? Because I mean, it would affect different years at different times, wouldn't it? If it was their first year, when they'd had no experience of university, they'd have even less kind of resources really to deal with the whole thing. If people have been in for a year or two, maybe they're in a slightly different position and with a slightly different perspective. So I just wanted to know, were they all the same year, or
Yes.
did you aim at a particular year group, or?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Carrie. And I think I forgot to mention that in my presentation. So one of the selection criteria that I'd put in place when sampling was that they were all in their first year of study during the academic year of 2019 to 20. Yeah, so that was one of the control variables between all participants. And it just helped me to see how obviously the changes of going to university, that brings a lot of challenges in itself, and then the pandemic was one more layer of anxiety on top of that. Yeah,
I would have thought they'd be more anxious than some of the other students maybe further on in their study.
That's right. Yeah, I think maybe postgraduates would have a little bit more sort of a foundation of how to deal with university. So yeah,
Lovely. Okay, thanks very much.
Nick.
Hi there, Emma. Well done. That's very, very good. I'm, by the way, part-time or very part-time academic at the University of Sheffield. Have been involved with these student projects to do with something else to do with public health and on gambling and stuff. The question I wanted to ask was, were there any issues and anxieties that you managed to find in relation to coming out of lockdown for the students? So when anxieties about, you know, whether they felt it was sufficiently safe to go out and meet people more, or sufficiently safe indeed to take a vaccination and stuff like that. So they're sort of emerging from the lockdown issues and anxieties.
Yeah, so that's another great question there, Nick. So I think I didn't specifically ask the students about how they felt coming out of the lockdown, but if I was to sort of speculate on what they would have said, I think firstly, students definitely coming to university, there's this sort of expectation of wanting this stereotypical university experience, you know, being able to meet lots of new students and the nightlife and all of those things that you look forward to. And I think because they missed out on that almost in the pandemic years, coming out of lockdown, I think they really were raring to go and get back out there and really make the most of the freedoms that we regained. And also, I think the younger generation were very receptive in terms of vaccination uptake. So they were very willing to take whatever precautions were needed in order to regain the freedoms. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions directly to Emma? Judy? You're muted, I'm afraid. Unmute, please.
I'll never.
Yes, you will. Keep trying.
Thank you, Emma. I just an observation as much as anything. First of all, your digital skills. I would like a tutorial from you, please. I enjoyed the presentation, but I was particularly interested in your comments about sleep, and also, and that, yeah, I think that is quite interesting in terms of what we might look at in future, but also reflecting how much some of the experience of the students could reflect. For example, I live on my own, you know, people like me who live on our own. Similar things were going on when we were in the lockdown, except that we were not far from our families and some of us were obviously, but we were still within our communities, whereas the students, especially if they were first year students, were just beginning to create their own new communities. And I wonder if that was something that you could, you know, between the students who were talking to them, maybe people who were back home also under lockdown.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, definitely students felt a little bit displaced when they were in a new environment and also away from their families and that support network that you have at home. So yeah, definitely, I think coming to university is quite an anxiety-inducing thing, and the pandemic was probably not much help during that time. Yeah.
New support was evolving as we were all trying to help each other and so on.
Yeah.
That reflect amongst students as well, that they were evolving their own new kinds of support to cope with the situation.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I think so. With everyone sort of being in the same boat, I think you definitely feel a bit of solidarity in that, and you can really relate to each other, and you know, nobody's alone in that. So I think new sort of support groups definitely formed in that way. And also, I wanted to mention this as well, that at the end of my interviews, all of the participants also almost expressed a gratitude for what had happened, because actually this has instilled sort of a newfound resilience in them to face future adversities as well. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to take Chair's privilege to tell a story really about last year's cohort of students, where of course the students who you were represented in your sample really. So these are the students who were medical students coming away from home, maybe for the first time, locked in their own rooms for one whole year, you know, more or less the entire year, but they were let out for one feature, which was the dissection. And so the only contact they had with human beings was around a dead body. And it just, you know, it's just like that's been a sort of bit of a metaphor for me for you know, thinking about the student experience you know, at that time.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Emma.
Tom, sorry, Karina's had a hand up for quite a long time as well.
Sorry, Karine. Thank you.
Emma, I just wanted to ask you if there were any lessons to be learned. Were there any feelings from the students about how the university should have done things differently, for example?
Okay. So I think with regards to what could have been done better, obviously the COVID student support team was quickly implemented as soon as the lockdown came into play there. So that was good, but I don't know how beneficial sometimes a welfare call is, because it's very easy to just say everything's fine. And I think students particularly find it a little bit difficult to express their difficulties. So maybe having something that was a little bit more sort of persistent and really trying to find out what was wrong would have been better. But again, I think if I had a bit more time to do a more in-depth research project, these would be questions that I would look into. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.